David, a black janitor, was mocked as a relic by a white manager. But when the bully began losing everything and hearing whispers in the dark, karma made its move. What happened next will shock you. But let's start from the beginning. Jack Renshaw stood at the front of the meeting room, wearing his trademark smirk, a look that conveyed both arrogance and condescension. His tailored suit and expensive watch screamed success, but beneath his polished exterior was a man who thrived on making others feel small. Jack wasn't particularly intelligent or innovative. His rise in the company had been fueled by privilege, charm, and a ruthless ability to put others down. His favorite pastime was belittling those he saw as beneath him. And his most frequent target? David Allen. David, a quiet, dignified black janitor in his mid-50s, had worked in the building for more than 30 years. He moved through the office with calm efficiency, often unnoticed, but always reliable. His presence was a constant, cleaning after hours, repairing what was broken, and offering a polite nod to employees rushing to their desks. Despite his humble role, there was an air of quiet pride about him, a dignity Jack couldn't stand. During a tense staff meeting, Jack spotted David quietly entering to clean the trash bins in the back of the room. Jack's lips curled into a sneer. Here was his chance to assert dominance. "Well, look who's here," Jack said loudly, cutting off the speaker mid-presentation. The relic himself. "David, you've been here so long. I'm surprised you haven't asked for your own office." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. "Tell me, what's the secret to sticking around for decades without ever moving up? I could use a few tips on staying stagnant." A few awkward chuckles echoed around the room, but most employees looked down at their notepads, avoiding eye contact. The tension was palpable. David paused, his hands tightening slightly around the handle of his mop. For a brief moment, his eyes met Jack's, calm but unwavering. "Respect isn't given to those who demand it through cruelty, Jack," David said quietly, his voice steady. "It's earned through kindness." The words hung in the air like a heavy mist, silencing even Jack's laughter. Though he tried to shrug it off, the unease settled deep in the room, and in Jack's mind, where it would linger longer than he anticipated. Jack Renshaw gripped the steering wheel of his luxury car, a satisfied smirk still lingering on his face as he cruised through the familiar streets of his upscale neighborhood. The echoes of his earlier humiliation of David Allen played like a highlight reel in his mind. He reveled in the power he held, the power to cut people down and walk away without consequence. As he turned onto his street, something felt off. The houses, usually pristine and orderly, seemed warped in the dim evening light. Windows were darker than usual, and the neatly trimmed lawns appeared wild, overgrown with shadows stretching unnaturally long. The streetlights flickered, casting erratic bursts of light that only made the eerie fog creeping through the neighborhood seem thicker. Jack blinked hard, shaking his head. "Exhaustion," he muttered, trying to dismiss the creeping unease. He parked his car and stepped out, the click of his shoes against the pavement echoing unnervingly loud in the silence. The fog seemed to curl around his ankles like unseen hands. Inside his house, the unease deepened. The front door creaked louder than usual as it swung shut behind him. The air inside felt different, colder, heavier. As Jack walked through the spacious, modern interior, he noticed small things that seemed wrong. A picture frame on the wall hung askew, despite him swearing it was straight that morning. His keys, which he always left on the kitchen counter, had somehow moved to the coffee table. Brushing it off as a simple lapse in memory, Jack poured himself a drink and settled into his armchair. That's when he heard it. A faint whisper, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. Jack froze. "Hello?" No response. The next morning, things worsened. Objects moved on their own. A chair scraping across the floor, doors opening and closing without cause. Mirrors reflected Jack's face, but his expressions seemed delayed or distorted, his reflection grinning when he wasn't. By midweek, Jack's paranoia had consumed him. He barely slept, jumping at every noise. At work, his composure cracked. He lashed out at colleagues for minor mistakes, barked orders incoherently, and muttered to himself about shadows and whispers. His superiors took notice. The once confident manager was unraveling, and his reputation, like his sanity, began to crumble. Jack's torment reached its peak when the nightmares began. Every night, he would fall into a restless sleep, only to find himself standing in an endless dark corridor. At the far end, David Allen would appear, calm and composed, just as he always was in life. But there was something different about him in the dreams, something almost otherworldly. David's gaze would lock onto Jack's, not with anger, but with quiet intensity, as though he could see straight into Jack's soul. "You've tipped the scales," David would say in a calm, measured voice, "and balance must be restored." Jack would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. At first, he dismissed the dreams as guilt manifesting in his subconscious, but they grew more vivid, more real, night after night. He couldn't escape David's steady gaze or his cryptic warnings. During the day, the hallucinations started. Jack saw David's face in reflections, in mirrors, in windows, even in the surface of his coffee. He'd glance at his phone and see a message flash on the screen. Balance must be restored. But when he looked again, the message was gone. His grip on reality began to slip. He lashed out at colleagues, accused friends of betraying him, and withdrew into isolation. His once pristine suits were now rumpled, and the dark circles under his eyes hinted at sleepless nights. Whispers filled his mind, growing louder by the day. Desperate for answers, Jack returned to the office late one night. He wandered through the empty hallways, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. His footsteps echoed as he made his way to the janitor's closet. There, he found David, quietly mopping the floor, as serene as ever. "You," Jack spat, his voice trembling. "You did this to me. You cursed me." David looked up, his expression unchanged. "I didn't curse you, Jack," he said calmly. "Your actions did. Sometimes, the world has a way of balancing itself." Jack froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. David's words sank in, heavy and undeniable. For the first time, Jack saw himself for what he truly was, the architect of his own downfall. The next morning, Jack finds himself homeless and disoriented, as if the world has turned against him. His bank accounts are frozen, his belongings seized, and his face plastered across the news for fraudulent activities he has no memory of committing. He realizes that the supernatural torment wasn't just a warning, it was karma in action. Stripped of his privilege, Jack is forced to reflect on his life and choices. Months later, a now humbled Jack seeks out David, not to demand answers, but to apologize sincerely. He finds David volunteering at a local shelter, helping the community with the same quiet dignity that Jack had once mocked. David listens to Jack's apology and offers him a chance to volunteer at the shelter. Jack reluctantly agrees, seeing it as an opportunity to atone. Through this experience, Jack learns humility and compassion, working alongside people he once considered beneath him. For David, it's a silent triumph, proof that dignity and kindness can outlast cruelty, and that karma, in its own time, can lead even the worst offenders to redemption.